Airbnb guidelines. Not again, you might say. You're probably tired of these at this point, and feel free to skip this section, or maybe just look at the slides. Or I've turned some of it into a set of a lab, in fact, this week that just reproduces the same content as in the slides here. Let me emphasize why I think this is important. JavaScript is quite a large language now. There are lots of different ways of doing the same thing, and most guidelines now would represent doing something one way rather than multiple ways. And to select one way that is got some backup in terms of its rationale, some best practice. This could be efficiency, it could be complexity, or it could be likely possibility of doing it one way, introducing bugs, and another way, making it less likely that bugs of a specific type might arise. So that's the background to these guides. We've already been through a couple of them already. Couple of parts of the same guide. And we look at naming conventions, comments, white space, commas, semicolons. That was our first attempt at it. And the last time we looked at this, we looked at references, variables, arrays, strings, objects, properties, and destructuring. Again, as you're going through this, you might be exposed to parts of JavaScript you never knew were there. And in fact, had you known they were there, might have made some part of your work to date a lot easier. So there's a payoff in terms of wading through this, as well as gathering some wisdom along the way. So this is the final one. We're looking at blocks, control statements, functions, arrow functions, and modules. Starting with blocks, use braces with all multi-line blocks. So I think this is fairly self-evident. We can do this, of course, that's perfectly legal, but I hope that this almost never been seen in the code we have to date. We would always be using braces here. And it's also suggesting that we use multi-line blocks. So the guideline says, and that's not so good. That is all in one line. This is what we should be doing. Remember, we're using ESLint to enforce these. So this is the rule we put into our ESLint RC file to enforce the rule in our IDE and in our linter. Now we could turn it off if we didn't want it. If you're using multi-line blocks with if and else, put else on the same line as the closing brace of the if. This should probably be turned on automatically. This is what's considered bad because you see we've got a brace in here on a line on its own. And down here we pull the else up onto the previous line. Why? Well, I guess it's for consistency. We do one or the other. And the good one is just a little bit easier to read. But there's no dramatic benefit apart from some more easily scanned code. So one more on blocks then. It's a little bit more subtle. Let's look at the bad example. Here I've got an if statement and there's a return on both branches. This guideline says, okay, there's no need for the else at all because we can do the return on the true part and then have a default or a standard return as the return value for the function. This one is for readability, really. You're not having to delve into evaluating the two conditions, true and false. You just look at the true case returns and then everything else returns y in that case. More examples of the same thing here. This one and this one. This one we've got an if statement inside the else. The else again is not needed. We can just have two if statements, one return x, one return y. So this is to do with largely readability. Some control statements then. This takes a bit of a while to get your head around, but it's all about making it easier to visually follow complex logic. So we've got complex logic that is a sophisticated Boolean expression, largely in an if statement. Then this guideline is around breaking it up into readable chunks, and some guidelines on which chunks to break it up into. So it's perhaps easier to look at just some examples here. This one is considered bad in that it's very hard to follow, and it's saying that you should break that up into pieces like this here in this example. In particular, we should be grouping on one line sub-expressions. So there's brackets around all these, so they all go to one line here, and then the two subsequent expressions are on their own lines below that. There's specific guidelines here on how to group them. It's going to be something quite difficult now for a linter to be smart enough to be able to do this, so it's a kind of a visual inspection we're relying on here. Don't use the selection operators in place of control statements. So you mightn't be aware, but it is possible to put something like this directly into on one line, and it would actually have the same meaning as this, but this is considered better because it's easier to read and we're used to reading that type of statement, whereas the former, this one, well, that control the eye and it's non-obvious. There's quite a lot of recommendations around functions. I'm just taking some of them here. Spacing in a function signature. So we're looking at where we put the spaces here. Space before function paren and space before blocks. So you can see here, it's around consistency, this one. Functions with multi-line signatures. Again, we're looking at being able to structure them carefully such that they're lined up according to an indentation scheme. So you might be tempted to go for something like this because you're doing some alignment based around here, whereas the guideline says we really should be following this structure here, which is following the two-space indent here for each of the parameters. This is only if we do want to, if we've got a very long parameter list and we can't fit it all on one line. Similarly with invocations, lining them up instead of this sort of hard to read syntax here where the foo, bar and baz are all on different column starts. This recommendation here was saying we put them all on the same column starts. Now we would often be, of course, putting all those on the one line, which is perfectly fine. This is just a small example of where there are multiple parameters, or maybe the words themselves are longer, or the identifiers are longer, that can fit on one line easily. Never reassign parameters. So F1 has a parameter A, and what we're doing in here is we're almost ignoring what A is immediately, and we're changing A to 1. This is better expressed with something like this. If A hasn't been passed, or if there's no value in A, we would check that first and only then perform the assignment. The reasons for this are to do with possibly unexpected behavior and bugs that could occur in certain circumstances, particularly if we've got, or we are trying to access the arguments value. Arguments is a list of the parameters available in JavaScript. We're not using that, so we haven't really seen something like this in action. Never mutate parameters. It's back to the same thing again, really. Modifying a parameter directly after it's been received, changing it or adjusting it to some new value. Again, unwanted side effects is the motivation here. Default parameters are probably what we should have used in both of those previous examples, and we haven't actually seen this. There's a part of JavaScript you might be interested in looking at. You can, when you're defining a function, you can specify a default value for some of the parameters. This can be useful. This means you don't have to check to see if no parameter is passed or if a parameter is missing and making some decision around that. We will have the default value if no value is made available. So default parameters, a good example of the kind of things you'll unearth as you go through these guides. Always put default parameters last. I think you can see why that might be the case. So 2 parameters to handle things, name and opts. The default one should be last, so if it's dropped, we know we're getting the default value. Finally, this used to be a mainstay of all the frameworks we're using, but now it's largely hidden, the notion of an IIFE, immediately invoked function expression. You'll see this in JavaScript occasionally. It means that we can drop this inside a page or in a script somewhere. It's kind of a curious looking thing. It's a function inside brackets. It's a function that will be called as soon as that line is hit. So it's a way of, if you like, triggering some sort of default behavior. I don't think we'll be using any IIFEs in the work we're doing, so we're kind of ignoring that really. Arrow functions. There's lots of fun stuff with arrow functions. We've been using them sparingly. Remember, they're a shorthand or an alternative syntax for defining functions, often in the context of callbacks, but not always. And in general, this guide says we should tend to use them where we would have used an anonymous function. So this is an example here of an array, a constant array, and we're calling the map function, which means it'll be called for each element in the array. And it takes an anonymous function that's given that element, so it's function x. Guideline says, please write that like this. It's considered, if we're used to arrow functions, a little bit easier to read, and it also has some aspects around scoping that are important. Always include parentheses around arguments for clarity and consistency. So in this map function here, we're not using brackets here, we are here to make it easier to read to a certain extent. And the same thing is happening here. If the function body consists of a single statement returning expression without side effects, omit the braces. This means really we're getting some potentially very concise code. So here is a map function operating across an array. Simplify all of that, even removing the brace to give us one line. Now we haven't been using MapReduce, or we've rarely been using this type of function when we've interacted with arrays. We've been largely iterating them over them manually. But there's a lot of interesting and fun algorithms associated with this type of operation, which means we can very quickly get some very concise expressions that do a lot of algorithmic work. So worth investigating when you have time. Finally, modules. Use them is the first thing, and we've been using them from start really. The older syntax is require, and this will still be visible in a lot of the sample applications you might be looking at. The newer syntax is import from, and there's a couple of different ways of doing it, but all of them really are better than the old style so-called CommonJS format. Try not to use wildcards. So it's possible in import, it's a bit like the way Java works, to import like this. Everything is imported and renamed. This is considered better. However, you can't actually avoid using this occasionally, particularly if the modules you're using are pre-ESM or ES6 modules, as what the new syntax is called. So there will be some complexities you'll encounter here for older modules, and there's a bit of churn going on in industry at the moment as some modules in the NPM world are being upgraded to using the syntax and some aren't. If they are developed pre-ESM, pre this new syntax, they can still be imported using the syntax, but you might need to jump through a few hoops to get it working correctly. only import from a path once. I think this is kind of common sense. So instead of importing on 2 different lines, we would import everything on the one line here. Don't export mutable bindings. That is, if you've got a variable, and let's say it's a write variable let, it's considered dangerous to export that. It means that it could be changed later on. It could lead to quite significant complexity if the value was mutated. If you're going to be exporting a value like this, make it a const. In modules with a single export, prefer default export over named export. We haven't really been adhering to this, in fact, so we could probably revisit certainly some of the controllers we've been building. Here we're exporting foo. If it's the only export, the guideline is make it the default export. That is, turn on default here. This encourages a pattern whereby modules export one thing only. It's considered, well, one way of reducing complexity to a certain extent. Pull all imports above all non-import statements. So this is something that is enforced quite strictly by our ESLint, in fact, and the rules we set up. Here I've got an import, some statement, another import. And you'll find that if you try this, I think in our IDE, it would do some rearranging here, just pulling the standard statement down below all the other imports. Multi-line imports should be indented just like multi-line arrays and object literals. So if we're going on too long for a given line length, you can see there how you might indent it correctly. Okay, that was a lot of stuff to take in one sweep through. So if you fast forwarded, I fully understand. And if you just prefer to browse the accompanying document on their website here, which is the same content as the slides, a little bit more in fact. So I've removed some of them for a walkthrough that are a little bit more obscure. And of course, you can also go directly to the original source, which is always available on GitHub.